When I was a kid, one of my heroes was a guy named Bob Riggle, because he had a car that could do something nobody else's car could do. Damn it! You all right?
Jay Leno has spent decades building one of the most talked about car collections on the planet, and yet most people who watch his videos can only name a handful of vehicles inside it. Ask a casual fan what sits in his garage and you'll hear the same answers every time. A McLaren F1, maybe a Duesenberg, perhaps one of his motorcycles. What almost nobody mentions are the machines tucked between those famous names, vehicles so unusual that even people who have watched his show for years have scrolled right past them without understanding what they were actually looking at. Some of these cars represent entire chapters of automotive history that failed commercially and vanished. Others are one-of-a-kind creations that don't fit into any normal category at all. And at least one of them was built using technology that the industry tried and abandoned twice, 40 years apart, in two completely separate attempts. Start with the sound. Most engines growl, rumble, or roar. This one whines, rising in pitch the higher it revs, almost exactly like a small aircraft warming up on a runway. That sound belongs to Leno's Chrysler turbine car, a genuine artifact from one of the strangest experiments in automotive history. In the early 1960s, Chrysler built a small fleet of cars powered entirely by jet turbine engines instead of pistons, then handed the keys to ordinary American families across the country just to see what would happen. The idea was audacious: replace decades of piston engine development with a turbine that could theoretically run on almost any combustible liquid, from diesel to kerosene to, according to legend, tequila. Drivers loved the novelty and the smoothness, but the economics never worked, and importing the Italian-built bodies came with steep tariffs that made the whole program a financial dead end. When the experiment wrapped up, Chrysler destroyed the vast majority of the cars rather than deal with the logistics of maintaining them. Only a handful survived, and fewer still can actually be driven today. Leno's connection to this particular car goes back to childhood. As a teenager, he stood at the 1964 World's Fair and watched one circle a display track again and again, unable to walk away. Decades later, once he had the means, he tracked one down and bought it outright. For years he drove it like any other car in his collection, until the turbine itself eventually seized after decades of wear, turning a rolling piece of history into an extremely expensive ornament. Getting it running again meant finding people who still understood 1960s turbine technology, which led him to a small aerospace company founded by the very engineer who built the original engine decades earlier. A team of veteran specialists spent significant time and effort resurrecting a power plant that idles at tens of thousands of rotations per minute and operates at temperatures hot enough to damage lesser materials in seconds. It isn't a static display piece sitting behind velvet rope. It's a functioning machine that happens to sound like it belongs at an airport instead of a stoplight. If the turbine car is at least somewhat known among serious fans, the next vehicle is the opposite, a car built to be completely forgettable on the outside while hiding something absurd underneath. Picture an unremarkable subcompact hatchback from the 1980s, the kind of anonymous economy car nobody would ever photograph. Now imagine two engineers deciding to rip out its tiny factory engine and drop in a turbocharged V6 borrowed from a performance sedan, then reroute the power to the rear wheels instead of the front. That's essentially what happened when a small boutique outfit built a series of cars using a cheap, humble hatchback as a shell for genuinely serious performance hardware. The builders hoped to sell hundreds of them to buyers who wanted supercar acceleration wrapped in a shape nobody would ever suspect. Reality had other plans. Each finished car cost roughly as much as a luxury sedan of the era, and convincing buyers to spend that kind of money on something that looked like a rental car proved nearly impossible. By the time production quietly ended, only a handful of examples existed, somewhere in the single digits. Leno owns one of the originals and has held onto it since it was new. Despite weighing barely over a ton, it can outrun sports cars that cost far more, launching to 60 miles an hour in well under 5 seconds and covering a quarter mile in the low 13s, numbers that embarrass several genuine sports cars from the same period. Leno later added nitrous oxide to push it even further beyond what its unassuming shape suggests it's capable of. It still has air conditioning. It still has comfortable seats and a proper steering wheel salvaged from a performance parts catalog. Nothing about the outside hints at what's happening mechanically underneath, which is exactly the point. And exactly why almost nobody watching a walkthrough of Leno's garage ever stops to give it a second look. Not every strange vehicle in the collection is disguised as something ordinary. Some of them were never meant to look like conventional cars in the first place. One designer with a long relationship with Leno builds machines that blur the line between vehicle and sculpture entirely. Their partnership started when Leno purchased one of the designer's earlier outlandish creations, a heavily customized, tank-like cruiser that became one of the most recognizable oddities in his collection. Years later, the same designer decided to reimagine something far smaller, an ordinary scooter. Rather than repeat an existing idea, he started with basic two-wheeled and three-wheeled scooters and rebuilt them from the ground up, stripping away the factory plastic bodywork entirely and replacing it with hand-formed aluminum panels riveted together the old-fashioned way. The resulting shapes look like something pulled directly out of a 1930s science fiction serial, low, bullet-shaped, and unmistakably Art Deco, built with the kind of exaggerated streamlining that old illustrators imagined future vehicles would have. Underneath the dramatic bodywork, the scooters remained fully functional. They still lean into corners the way a normal scooter does. They still reach highway speeds. And the designer has argued that the enclosed, aerodynamic shape actually improves stability in crosswinds compared to a standard open scooter. Only a small handful were ever built, and Leno ended up owning two of the earliest examples produced. They don't fit into any conventional automotive category. They aren't muscle cars, they aren't luxury cars, and they certainly aren't practical daily transportation. They are rolling design experiments, built essentially one at a time by a single craftsman, and Leno keeps them around precisely because they refuse to be categorized. Strange shapes are one kind of surprise. Complete anonymity is another, and it's arguably more interesting because it hides in plain sight. Somewhere in the collection sits a coupe from a car brand that most Americans today couldn't identify even if the name were written on the hood. The company behind it was founded by a wealthy heir obsessed with one specific goal, winning the 24 hours of Le Mans with an American car and an American driver, something no one had accomplished before. When race organizers changed the rules and required manufacturers to build a minimum number of road-legal cars to qualify for entry, the founder had no interest in running an actual car company, but built one anyway rather than give up on the goal. Chassis were built domestically, then shipped across the Atlantic to an Italian coach builder for hand-finished bodywork before being shipped back for sale in the United States, an absurdly expensive way to build a car that ultimately made each unit cost nearly as much as a much larger luxury sedan of the era. Production wound down after a tiny handful of examples were completed, split between open convertibles and closed coupes. Despite the commercial failure, the design was considered significant enough that a major art institution later named it among the best contemporary automotive designs of its decade. On the track, the effort came remarkably close to succeeding, finishing third overall at Le Mans in back-to-back years, an extraordinary result for a small American operation racing against factory teams from much larger European manufacturers. The brand never had the resources or the marketing reach to build a lasting following, and today most car enthusiasts would walk straight past one of these coupes without recognizing it as anything special. Leno keeps is not because it's the fastest or the most valuable thing in the building, but because it represents an entire chapter of ambition that never found the audience it deserved. That theme of brilliant engineering that history quietly forgot resurfaces again, and this time it comes back wearing a jet engine of its own. Decades after Chrysler abandoned its turbine experiment, an entirely different turbine project began almost the same way many of Leno's strangest builds begin, as a rough idea sketched out during a conversation. This time it started between Leno and his longtime chief mechanic, who brought the concept to a major automaker's design studio. Within a matter of weeks, rough sketches turned into a real automotive shape, borrowing visual language from fighter jets and open-wheel racing cars. The finished concept debuted at a major automotive trade show, built around a modified sports car chassis and wrapped in a body made of carbon fiber lead over Kevlar. Underneath that dramatic shell sits a genuine helicopter turbine engine, the same type used in rescue helicopters, producing roughly 650 horsepower. It runs primarily on biodiesel, with a small separate tank of jet fuel reserved purely for starting the engine before the system switches over to the greener fuel source. Leno jokes about the fuel economy, which sits somewhere in the single digits of miles per gallon, meaning the car is really only practical to drive after a particularly good harvest. On paper, The concept is theoretically capable of speeds approaching 245 miles an hour, though in practice it exists purely as a rolling demonstration, proof that turbine power could still deliver serious performance. Decades after the technology's original commercial failure. Placed side by side, the two turbine cars in Leno's collection form a 40-year conversation between two very different generations of engineers, both chasing the same unconventional idea, both ultimately abandoned by the broader industry around them. Turbines aren't the only extinct technology sitting in that building. Entire car brands went extinct too, and several of them are parked only a few feet away from each other. One example was built by a former top executive at a major automaker who left with a fortune and used it to build cars under his own name, engineering an overhead cam V8 that cooled itself without relying on a conventional water pump. The company built somewhere in the range of a dozen thousand cars before folding entirely, and only a small fraction are believed to survive anywhere today. Another example represents the first rotary engine car ever sold to the public, built by a small European manufacturer years before rotary engines became more widely known through a much larger Japanese automaker. The same engine sealing problems that plagued this early rotary eventually caught up with the manufacturer's larger, more ambitious follow-up model, and the brand was ultimately absorbed into a company that still exists today under a completely different name. A third example is a British Grand Tourer that combined a large, relaxed American V8 with a lightweight fiberglass body and genuinely advanced adjustable suspension technology for its era. Only a few hundred were ever built, and the model has spent decades overshadowed by a more famous successor that borrowed its underlying design. None of these three brands survive today in any meaningful form. Each one represents a company that attempted something genuinely different and lost the business fight anyway, leaving behind only a small number of surviving cars as evidence that the attempt ever happened. The final vehicle worth mentioning proves that sometimes the rarest secrets hide inside the most recognizable badges rather than the most obscure ones. A certain full-size luxury sedan from a major German manufacturer was never a normal car to begin with. Every window, the sunroof, the seats, and even the trunk lid operate on a complex hydraulic system instead of ordinary electric motors, and it was engineered in the 1960s and 1970s with almost no regard for cost. That approach made it the most expensive production car in the world at launch, priced above even the finest British luxury sedans of the time, and it became the default choice for heads of state, business magnates, and, notably, more than a few authoritarian leaders around the world. Famous owners over the decades have included some of the biggest names in music and entertainment. The engineering underneath is almost absurdly overbuilt. The body and chassis are bolted together with such rigidity that lifting one corner of the car raises both tires on that side clean off the ground simultaneously. Despite weighing well over 2 tons fully equipped, its large displacement V8 could still push the car to a genuinely respectable top speed for a luxury sedan of its era. Only a small number of exotic variants ever left the factory, including a convertible parade version, a stretched limousine with additional rear-facing seats, and a fully armored edition built for customers who needed real protection. Very few of these cars were ever officially brought into the United States, making an example on American soil rare enough on its own, long before anyone starts modifying one further. Leno has called it his personal favorite car in the entire collection, a preference that traces back to his teenage years working at a dealership where delivering one of these cars across the country felt like the height of luxury. The manufacturer never offered a supercharged version from the factory, yet Leno's example has one anyway, professionally installed by a specialist restorer known specifically for working on this exact model. The modification pushes output from roughly 300 horsepower up to more than 500, making it, as far as anyone can determine, the only supercharged example of its kind in existence anywhere in the world. The restoration and maintenance process for these cars is famously punishing, with individual components costing thousands of dollars to replace and a hydraulic system considered among the hardest in the world to service correctly. That's part of why so few owners actually drive theirs regularly. Leno drives his anyway, and that single habit captures what makes his garage fundamentally different from a typical museum. A museum protects rarity behind glass and expects visitors to admire it from a distance. Leno starts the engines, drives the turbine-powered oddities, the disguised economy car, the extinct brands, and even a luxury sedan that technically shouldn't exist in this configuration, treating every one of them the same way he treats his most famous machines, as tools meant to be understood, not simply displayed. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.